Okay, so first, Anthony M. Donaldson, Jr. He is an assistant professor of history at Sewanee, the University of the South. His work explores the intersectionality of race, class, and identity. Anthony got his BA and MA at North Carolina Central University and received a certificate in political economy from Hong Kong University. Anthony received his PhD here at UF. Anthony's forthcoming manuscript, Out of White Control, is under contract with UNC Press. And Madison Cates. Madison Cates is an assistant professor of history at Coastal Carolina University and the co-director of the Bell W.
Baruch.
Baruch. Baruch.
Yes.
Bell W. Baruch Institute for South Carolina Studies in Georgetown, South Carolina. Before this, he taught at Georgia Southern University and the University of Florida, where he received his PhD in 2020.
That's all we need to say about that.
His work examines the intersections between race, environmentalism, and social justice in the South, and it has been published in a recent issue of the Journal of Southern Cultures. So please give a round of applause.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here and for sticking with us through the afternoon. I hope everybody's sufficiently caffeinated, and it's great to be back. Always in Gainesville, there's the sun, there's the rain, there's the gentle hum of mopeds driving by, so everything is as it should be. Also, this conference has been incredible, as we all know, and befitting the man of the hour, and so I hope I'll hold up my end of the bargain, and we'll hand the baton off tomorrow morning to Dr. Wink. So before I sort of get started with my talk, I just wanted to sort of mention that along with my esteemed co-panelist, was also part of what I think was called the North Carolina to Gainesville pipeline. In the old days of ACC basketball, there was the the Brooklyn to Chapel Hill pipeline. We sort of kept going. And so for me, growing up in a small town in North Carolina where all my family is, I knew Dr. Link's work and his on William Friday, and I had done some work on white moderates in North Carolina, and felt, it was good enough for him to move down here. It was good enough for me. He was such an encouraging mentor, somebody who knew when to give you a good nudge. Very few people was I always either excited or dreading receiving a text message from, but he somehow always knew that exact time when I needed to get back to work. So thank you for that, and for all your mentorship and encouragement, and guiding me through Southern history, through all the grad school and job market process. And I think we all owe an immense debt of gratitude to you for that. So, and hopefully that's evident in some of what I'm going to talk about today. When I came to Gainesville and did independent study with Dr. Link my first semester, I think as others have said, he really encouraged me to read as widely as he had read of the literature, and so that was a difficult but very worthwhile experience. And sort of out of that, when I think about the South, and when we talk about the South, one of the things that I know that was he impressed upon me, and many other scholars have done, is that with the South, ideas about place are always at the forefront. The South is both a geographic region, as we know, and an idea that is continually imagined and reimagined. And perhaps like any place, but I think particularly for Southerners of all backgrounds, what ties us people to the region can be both a mixture of love and hate. Pat Conroy, the South Carolina writer, I think put it best when he opens one of his novels saying, "My wound is geography, but it is also my anchor, my port of call." In defining what makes the South worthy of study, I would like to submit that we can start with the land, the dynamic landscapes, soil, sky, water that characterize this part of the world and that we share with those who come before us. in thinking about the land, to draw from William Faulkner, for example, his short story, The Bear, the land, Southerners have complex ties to the land, both as a physical space and a symbolic space. Faulkner speaks to this. One of his characters cries in the dialogue in the short story. He says, "Don't you see, this whole land, the whole South is cursed, and all of us who derive from it, whom it ever suckled, white and black, lie under the curse." In this lament, we see the land is both cursed by centuries of injustice and bloodshed, but it also nurtures those who live and work upon it. This juxtaposition of place, both tainted and sustaining, full of woe and beauty, it's long characterized Southern history. But for me, I was particularly struck by this when it came to the 1960s, to the war on poverty, when I began to sort of go through thinking up my dissertation and all those things. And just what I was struck by, moving from having read Paradox to Southern Progressivism my first semester here, and thinking through the first half of the 20th century, despite all the changes that this modern South had seen, I was struck by that many Southern communities knew more of hookworms, hard times, because the progressives didn't quite get rid of all of them in the 19-teens and 20s, knew more of hard times than the reputed Moonlight and Magnolias. One such place where I want to draw our attention today is, of course, the Southern Mountains, Southern Appalachia, one of the American regions most closely tied to the war on poverty. Appalachia offers a microcosm of the changes and continuities in the physical, economic, and political landscapes of the modern South. More specifically, I want to present the history of a 15-ish year-long controversy over the damming of the New River as a case study to understand this theme of place and land as simultaneously bearing the scars and beauty of this region. This is a story of dams that were never built, which are always the most fascinating thing. So, as Dr. Geeson was talking about, seeing a landscape that is both full of presences and absent, what is present, what is absent. But in cheating death, in defeating these dams, the New River has much to tell historians about the transformation of the modern South. And just for context, the New River, first of all, is not new. It's one of the oldest rivers in the world. It starts in the northwestern corner of North Carolina around the Boone area, carves this northwestern route across southwest Virginia, eventually ends up near Charleston, West Virginia. Alongside towering mountain peaks and fertile valleys, the New is one of the defining geographic features of this part of the South. And for all its beauty, like much of Appalachia, it appeared to many outside eyes in the early 20th century with the progressives, but also by the mid-20th century as another example of Appalachian underdevelopment and destitution. Into this situation stepped the Appalachian Power Company, or APCO, APC, part of AEP, we'll just call it APCO, because that's what makes sense to me, it's easier to say, who proposed building two massive hydroelectric dams on the upper part of the river, which is actually the southern part of the river near the Virginia-North Carolina border. They first proposed this, what was known as the Blue Ridge Project in 1964, and the company saw itself as a kind of savior of rural America, one of the few institutions, certainly private institutions, promising to bring jobs and prosperity to an area that was once known as the Lost Provinces, particularly three counties, one in Virginia, Grayson County, two in North Carolina, Allegheny, and Ashe County. Although this was a private venture, it echoed this familiar narrative about Southern Appalachia. If we think about the progressives, this deficit model of bringing the local versus the outside, the urban reform coming in and assuming a place is lacking something, bringing in knowledge, expertise. In some ways, the war on poverty takes that in a similar, although in some ways different direction. But you see this theme of the land as both blighted and beautiful in a lot of the rhetoric of the war on poverty. In his famous 1963 book, The Other America, Michael Harrington described Appalachia saying that, quote, an incredible social ugliness lay behind the scenic charms in the mountains. Similarly, the ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission, in its 1964 report said, rural in Appalachia does not mean a checkerboard of rich farms. Instead, dense but narrow ribbons of bleak habitation wind along the valley roads and up the tributary hollows. The New River Valley, like many parts of the South, was considered a rural slum, a particular term peculiar term in particular that is really traced to the 1960s, the war on poverty. To local boosters who craved new industry, like many in the modern South, this Blue Ridge project seemed like a godsend. In Grayson County, agricultural employment had declined by over half in the 1950s. Ashe County, North Carolina, ranked 91st out of the state's 100 counties in per capita income. So given all this, given the state of affairs, I ask, we ask, should ask, why would so many residents of this river valley fight to defeat a dam project and the jobs it provided? And I would say that the answer, and this is not the only community, and I'd be glad to sort of talk about some of the other similar cases in which you have, in sort of the new era of environmental law, southern communities fighting off massive dams and the few that didn't. But I think the answer goes much deeper than simple, not in my backyard, NIMBYism. The anti-dam, particularly because in this case, the anti-dam activists assembled this coalition, locals, non-locals, liberals, moderates, conservatives, national media figures like George Will and Bill Moyers. You have Barry Goldwater, Scoop Jackson, senators on usually on opposite sides of the aisle joining hands, and yes, the helm-sized elephant in the room, Jesse Helms and Sam Ervin. What drove their fascination and what drove their care for this river valley in southern Appalachia? Why would they take up this environmental cause? In short, I think the New River Salvation is not just a symbol of the political power of modern environmentalism, important as that is, and new laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, important as that was. It's also a story about the cultural power of ideas about rurality, nostalgia, and Southern identity. This effort was not simply to save a beautiful place, though again it is quite beautiful, but also a community of 4,000 people that would be displaced and whose lives would be altered by the inundation. The anti-dam campaign also, its sort of national reach gave Americans writ large a revised image of Appalachia, the place of stories about coal fields and corruption, and the images of rundown cabins and remote hollers. The New River activists provided images of free-flowing waters, newsreels of farmhouses, and verdant hillsides. Where the anti-poverty discourse portrayed Appalachia and the rural South as an unfortunate exception to American prosperity in the post-war period, by the end of this affair, it seemed that the nation found something preserving in a region it once found lacking. The rural mountainous landscape could offer virtue instead of vice. And I'll say this story, and particularly what I'll focus on, the role of media coverage and the national campaign around it, I think has a lot to say for this literature on the Sun Belt South. When we think of the Sun Belt South, or at least a lot of what I read when I came here to Gainesville, was about the suburbs and was about Charlotte and Atlanta and Houston, and it's important as all those places were, especially a lot of the political history was focused on this idea of a power shift, that this is where people were going, this is where after Baker versus Carr, this is where all the votes were, right, and this is where modern conservatism is. But I think, drawing especially from my favorite biographer of Jesse Helms, is that, as much as the suburbs are important, folks in the suburbs, politicians, conservative, liberal, this crisis of the rural South, if you can call it that, I would call it that, demanded attention from others outside of the region, the New River being a great example. Economic plight of many ex-urban communities attracted attention and concern. Places like the New River Valley neither faded from view nor lost their relevance. And I think the sort of perceived decline or depopulation of the rural South, the enclosure, the decline of the traditional agricultural economy was not just a fait accompli. It really raised concerns. One, that there were these rural roots of the urban crisis, which is something that I don't think has been fully studied, but also that, that there was this immense concern among politicians like Helms, like Sam Ervin. I think some of Helms drawing from his, from rereading Righteous Warrior, maybe some of his growing up in Monroe. And so, What I would suggest to sum up is the history of the southern countryside and the burgeoning Sunbelt metropolises remain inextricably linked, excuse me. Involvement of new and traditional Southern conservatives in the New River controversy shows that they were not merely concerned with issues of busing, federal overreach, courting the votes of white suburbanites, but the fate of this valley of river towns and hamlets like Mouth of Wilson, Virginia, became an issue of bipartisan and national concern that was personal, political for many. And that, I would say, that's what's remarkable to me about the New River case, the New River controversy. That you have this unusual coalition, Jesse Helms working with environmentalists and all that stuff, farmers and environmentalists, but it proves crucial to defeating the New River dams. There is this legal story, which I'm going to kind of set to the side with all due respect to the legal historians in there, about the Federal Power Commission and a lot of the blocking of this license that the Federal Power Commission had issued to Appalachian Power to build these dams. It didn't ultimately defeat the project, but it stalled for time and allowed activists to make their case through both the media blitz and lobbying Congress to protect the New River under the Wild and Scenic Rivers system. And so we're going to look at kind of three different areas. One, the grassroots. Two, the media. And sort of three, high politics. The campaign to save the New River was ultimately a local cause with a national reach. The main organization opposing the dams, the National Committee for the New River, or NCNR, as I'll call it for short, drew from local residents as well as state legislators and activists from urban areas across the affected states. But like many environmental causes, the NCNR had to reckon with charges that it did the bidding of well-funded outside environmental groups, kind of the traditional idea of, are you an environmentalist or do you work for a living? In response, they emphasized the homegrown nature of their movement. One of the leaders of the campaign, State Senator Ham Horton, a Republican of Winston-Salem, who had spent a lot of time, many vacations in the River Valley, was pretty adept at flipping the script on the power company. In one press conference, he portrayed them as those who actually represented big city outside interests. Describing those, the River Valley residents, Horton said, they've lived on the land and loved it for 200 years. Now they're being asked to let everything they've held dear go underwater to provide electricity for some apartment dweller's toothbrush in Chicago. Such emotional appeals became common part, with the multi-generational rural landholder being sacrificed to benefit the faceless urban apartment dweller. All of this is part of painting the New River as a rare place in a mobile, sprawling America where people seem to cling to the land at all costs and all odds. In the mid-1970s, the NCNR considered a few creative public relations strategies to gain wider support. In one internal memo, a Durham-based activist said it was a waste of money to hire a Capitol Hill-based lobbyist. Instead, he said it would be more effective to send, quote, a couple of busloads of overawed farmers to pay Congress a visit. Similarly, a Virginian advised his fellow activists not to, quote, underestimate the value of gimmicks in gaining publicity. To that end, he suggested they, again, recruit local farmers, this time to stage a tractor march outside the district offices of a pro-dam congressman. These suggestions, while never acted upon as far as I can tell, illustrate how far this campaign went or considered going in order to reinforce its grassroots bona fides. In doing so, they embody an ironic truth about the New River campaign. The more it emphasized the local stakes and the local faces of the cause, the more that national media, activist groups, and politicians flocked to defend it. Out of these determined efforts, the New River and its people became the subject of adoring media coverage. In 1971, New York Times reporter Ned Kenworthy wrote a series of articles on the New River after taking a canoeing trip with anti-dam activists. These pieces all shared a focus of what he described as, quote, the sorrow and anger of local residents over the proposed loss of ancestral homes and land. Interviewing one landowner, Kenworthy thought it important to tell his audience that, quote, local misgivings were voiced in a countryman's language as this man lamented the impending inundation of his sprawling farm. In follow-up stories on the dam fight, Kenworthy wrote with subtle yet palpable admiration for the river and its defenders, even going so far to opening an article by quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, "A river is more than an amenity, it is a treasure." Similar national coverage followed. 1 month after Kenworthy's initial story, Bill Moyers profiled the Grayson County town of Mouth of Wilson in his Bill Moyers Journal series for PBS. The report that followed contrasted the seemingly unique, tranquil way of life there, the looming threat of the dam projects. Similarly, and soon after, a 1974 NBC News broadcast featured the sights and sounds of the News' gentle waters and rolling hills, while also profiling local activists. Interviewed in front of his silos while light snow fell in the background, dairy farmer Jack Phipps mourned that he would have to leave the area if the dams went through. Next, the news crew featured activist and retired lawyer Sidney Gamble of Ashe County, who stressed the point that the activists, the folks threatened by the dams, were kind of a rural, silent majority. He said they're good people, honest people, law-abiding people. They pay their taxes, they support their government. And it's these kind of glowing profiles that I think resonate with a national audience, primarily white audience, who saw in the New River Valley on the TV screens alongside images from Vietnam and about Watergate. And it gives a different side of America in the 1970s. A simple, tranquil place with communities that seemed to be free of protest or poverty or pollutants. The anti-dam activists also found an ally in the Winston-Salem Journal. Its new editor, Wallace Carroll, former Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, became invested in saving the New River. Often it was Carroll who brought journalists, including Ned Kenworthy, others, to explore and canoe the river. And in part, out of these efforts, in the final days of the dam fight, newspaper editorial boards from Los Angeles to Philadelphia, St. Louis to Seattle stood in solidarity with the New River and what one described as the proud community of country folk whose forebears tended the land before the American Revolution. Even conservatives like George Will joined the ranks of the river's defenders. In 1976 column, he touted the river as a triumph of happy fixity, which I should note, Microsoft Word hates the word fixity. It says it's not a word. I guess it's not. I guess he meant rootedness or something. It's a triumph of happy fixity in a restless nation. Wow, and he equated damming it with turning the Louvre into a strip mall. Meanwhile, Washington, Will's one-time boss, Senator Jesse Helms, joined Sam Ervin, his then colleague, and members of the North Carolina House delegation, and filing a bill to pursue a wild and scenic designation, for the new. This was in 1973. It'll go through a few rounds and eventually, spoiler alert, it'll get passed. But at the time, a newcomer in Washington, Helms promised his wholehearted support for the bill, even though he was constantly needled for saying, "Oh, you do not mind environmentalists at times," and he had to sort of always explain, right? My constituents need no fear, I will change my position, right? This is about my constituents, which true to sort of form. As he lamented, and I think Helms' embrace of this environmental cause is about more than just political expediency. He lamented in a letter to Agricultural Secretary Earl Butz. Can I just say I would hate to be locked in a room with those two, but nonetheless, right, they're high on my list. In a letter to Earl Butz, he said, quote, "It would be a great injustice to set aside the property rights of families that have worked this land for so long." And when I read that, I thought, and maybe I asked Dr. Link at the time, how often does Jesse Helms use the word injustice? Now we know what an injustice is to him. And certainly he and other Republicans made a conservative case for protecting the river, emphasizing property rights, local control. But I think it's just as telling, albeit unsurprising, that Helms saw injustice here while seeing so little of it elsewhere. We can think, I think we can connect this a lot with this idea of the silent majority. Predominantly white communities, whether in rural areas threatened by dams or suburban neighborhoods protesting busing. The former TV pundit saw himself in this way, defending people, at least in his mind, defending people whose way of life was imperiled by what he considered to be indifferent and elitist institutions, bureaucracies, what have you. Along the river, residents also portrayed their cause as that of a kind of silent majority. 1970s wore on, letters poured into local newspapers with that consistent message. One from Independence, Virginia spoke for many in the Mid-Winston-Salem Journal when it said, "I am for the people who live and whose ancestors live close to the land, the good, religious people who are for the sound dollar and good, clean government." For the NCNR and other anti-dam groups, this was welcome publicity. It helped them make the controversy about the injustice done to the people, or potential injustice in their communities, and not so much a question about ecological harm or energy production or anything like that. Former Valley residents who had moved away also lent their voices to the cause, and which in turn became trumpeted as evidence of the river's unique charms. One Atlanta woman whose family had owned farmland in Grayson County for 8 generations wrote to Senator Harry Byrd, asking him to defend the river as, quote, "a priceless heritage of the American people." And in doing furthermore, she explains, she distinguishes between the people who live there and what she called the typical highly mobile, often transferred Americans versus the Valley residents who were Americans deeply rooted to their farms, whose values are in the land itself. Another former resident living in New York warned readers of the Galax Gazette that the dam project would transform this perfect region of Virginia into a giant construction camp, resembling the Northeast with all the smell and sights industry. And among Virginia's most prominent former residents, Earl Hamner Jr. created the Waltons TV series, grew up near just outside Charlottesville. He wrote an open letter and radio ad entitled "A River is a Holy Thing," deriding the Blue Ridge Project as threatening to turn the new into, quote, "an antiseptic river, a sluggish stream contained in concrete walls, of no use to anyone," on par with the Los Angeles River where he lived at the time. Against these sordid descriptions of urban life from those who left the region, activists juxtaposed images of the new river as a rare place defined by the kind of beauty and simplicity and longevity that was seemingly at odds with what many considered to be urbanized, industrialized, and rootless America. Despite growing public support in the mid-1970s, the bill to designate the new as a scenic river went nowhere initially in Congress. In response, you see new public relations gimmicks or schemes cooked up. One that was probably ultimately most effective: hundreds of Valley residents traveled to Washington, D.C. to make their appeals through a unique kind of press briefing in the Senate caucus room. There, local musicians offered bluegrass tunes, while displays featuring handmade quilts, cheeses, canoes created a veritable living museum of the way of life that could be lost. And then retired Senator Sam Ervin hammered home what was at stake. Speaking to those gathered, he boomed, "There's only one new river in the world, and if it's destroyed and the country turned into mudflats, the Lord God Almighty, with the assistance of the AFL-CIO and all the power companies in the world, cannot replace it." When the bill remained mired in legislative gridlock, Ervin and his ilk continued to batter at what he called the Unholy Alliance, organized by the AFL-CIO. Was a big supporter for the jobs angle of this project and power companies. Not long after, the dam fighters finally broke through their opposition. By August 1976, the Scenic River Bill cleared its final legislative hurdle through the House, the Senate, revoking the FPC license for the dams and designating the river as a wild and scenic waterway. The Senate soon followed suit, and on September 11th, 1976, President Ford signed the bill. Defeated, the power company cut their losses and abandoned the project. But despite all this, despite this victory, the need for the new river did not diminish from after 1976. And since then, it's only evolved. For instance, state and local officials wasted no time trying to spin the straw of the valley's newfound celebrity into the gold of tourism dollars. A full-page ad from the North Carolina Tourism Office soon appeared in Southern Living, featuring an aerial photograph of the river with the words, "Come see the state that kept the world's second oldest river from dying of a natural cause." Real estate companies swooped in and sold vacation homes to wealthy folks from the DC metro, all kinds of cities, from Florida as well. Floridians, one thing I learned about moving here is they love Western North Carolina. I had no idea how much. By the early 1980s, a Miami company with the wonderful name Ecological Developments became the largest landowner in Ashe County. Although scenic easements were established along the river, new vacation homes brought more people and more pollution. Zoning, of course, remained ever unpopular. By the 1990s, local activists lamented that those looking to tour scenic river would find a tour of homes instead. Nonetheless, at its height, the New River controversy represented an important flashpoint in histories of Appalachia, the modern South, and American environmentalism. In an age of energy scarcity, declining rural political power, the combined efforts of grassroots activists, bipartisan politicians, the media defeated a massive hydroelectric project backed by the lobbying prowess of organized labor and a large private utility. It also showed how parts of the southern mountains, there is this kind of bipolar understanding of Appalachia, how it's reimagining of this section, at least, of the mountains outside of the war on poverty. The recognition given the new and other rivers like it was built on the fusion modern conservatism with nostalgic, sentimental appeals to a vibrant rural life, all in the service of environmentalist goals. Terms like rural slum and backward area became overshadowed by images of rural homesteads, rolling hills, and free-flowing rivers. If the Great Society sought to make Appalachia more like the rest of America, the New River controversy offered a momentary inversion of that paradigm. Now, many like George Will and Bill Moyers agreed, they were on the same page about his scene, wanted America to be more like a suddenly reimagined Appalachia. As the optimistic politics of the new frontier gave way to the cynical politics of Watergate in the 1970s, the cause of the New River seemed refreshing. Many Americans, especially many white Americans, unwittingly or maybe incorrectly assumed that the region was free of racial difference, that the inequalities that had been exposed by the Black freedom struggle were not present. On top of that, environmental and cultural narratives about the river seemed to offer simplicity in a restless age, virtue for a nation worn down by scandal and war, and an endangered beauty amid the increasingly standardized landscape of post-war America. Finally, these grassroots struggles help explain how areas of the rural South, once considered blighted, are now considered prime tourist attractions for their rich cultural and natural landscapes. And I think there are lessons here for our future conversations about the South. Notions of place and Southerners' connection to the land remain a rich vein of scholarship, consider the region's past, present, and I would say future as well. And that's one thing I think Dr. Link, from a lot of our conversations, always impressed on me is telling that the past always has this relevance, and we need to think about how to tell a usable story for a present situation. I think that's certainly true for the growing South today. Displacement is as much a Southern story as being rooted in place. When we think about gentrification in places like Charleston or Asheville, Austin, when we think about the region's coastline, some of the work that I'm doing now, places like the Gullah Geechee corridor, and the displacement that's happened there in development. When we think about climate change, what will managed retreat look like? How will mountain communities in the Upper South deal with the growth of climate refugees? Who stays in the South and who leaves the South has been a constant through line through which we can measure and should continue to measure whether liberty, justice for all remain a lucid reality for all Southerners. Thank you.
Let me make sure. All right, how you guys doing? Thank you for having me. All right, Madison, that's my guy. So I just wanted to follow up with the fact that I'm kind of going to build on this anti-poverty conversation, but with the thread of Black power and also some stories with the Dr. Link. All right, so a beginning, primary source. So January 13, 2013, at 6:28 p.m., I write to Dr. Link from a Yahoo account. So you understand how far back this goes. I've read nearly every book you've written twice. I cited your work on my thesis. I'm a graduate of North Carolina Central University. I was working on my master's, and I was pretty much trying to discuss the campaign between Harvey Gantt and Jesse Helms. But even that has its own story. But for now, you can see my plea to reach out to Dr. Link, who at the time, believe it or not, I still thought he was at UNCG, right? So he responds, good to hear from you. January 13, 2013. He doesn't know me, right? He's never heard from me. He's never met me. This is a long shot. I'm throwing something against the wall, and he responds. I'm shocked. I'm going to pursue something very challenging, demanding for you, right? Now, at this point, I didn't know what this meant, right? But he's telling me about the McKnight program and the funding that will be required to even join UF's PhD program. But here's the problem. The deadline is January 15th. What day is it? January 13th. Now this is after office hours, so if this is so I have the 14th and perhaps early parts of the 15th to get this complete. But that's not the only thing. I have to turn in the McKnight application as well as the UF application, right? Here we go, March 1st. Now, I've done everything he's asked. I'm saving you the time of what I went through to get it done. I got it done within 30 hours. I had friends all over Durham. By the way, I live in Houston, Texas at the time. I'm getting letters of recommendations, the paper form. This isn't digital, right? They have to put them in an envelope, have to give them expedited, sent to make it to their offices on time. Anyway, so he writes back after, Elizabeth Dale had told me I got accepted, but she says there's no funding. He says, without McKnight, I couldn't advise you to come. Unfunded students are at a distinct disadvantage. At this point, it's not looking good. And long story short, we end up finding some funding, and I arrived. And at some point, I eventually defended my dissertation, you can see, and there's more stories to come, but just wanted to kind of give you a context of where this all begins, because before we can get into my research and my work, you're not going to appreciate the nature of how I even arrived in the, what you guys call academe, right? Or having become an academician. So here we are. I'm working for the Obama campaign. So my entry point into academics is activism. So in my mind, I was all in with Obama, right? You couldn't tell me anything. Field organizer. I slept 2-3 hours a day for about 2 years, lost 17 pounds. I'm all over the place. And then in this moment, I'm doing a registration drive, and it looks like this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is Durham. Anyway, as I'm traveling through this campaign, I'm wondering why, and I'm gonna connect two thoughts here. In the state legislature in North Carolina, it's disproportionately Democrat at the state level, but they vote Republican on the national level. I couldn't reconcile these two. I couldn't understand why this was the case, and then at some point I started talking to people and they would tell me there's this thing called Jessicrats, right? They're telling me Jessicrats. These are individuals that vote Democrat on a local level, but Republican on a national level. But I'm in activist mode. I'm not understanding what that means. Eventually, I start to get introduced to this Jesse Helms character, right? Historically speaking, through Righteous Warrior. I'm learning it on the spot, trying to absorb as much information. And this is a big book. And my means is to get Obama elected, not go to grad school while I'm campaigning, But I need to know what's going on because it is associated in its own strange way to my interest in Harvey Gantt. Barack Obama, when he was a young man, was actually supporting Harvey Gantt's campaign. And in its own way, this created this crazy paradox, right? A Southern paradox. It's everything you're laughing about is exactly what I was thinking. Like, this is a lot, okay? I'm learning these terms called the social way of life. I'm introduced to Paul Lubke, rest in peace. I'm learning about Tar Heel politics. I'm learning about all of these progressive myths, right? And as we progress, no pun intended, I developed a great question. And first, I would be remiss, which I'll save time towards the end to shout out those who've helped me get to this point. So I don't want to steal my own thunder. But for now, let me stay focused. I created, as I got closer and closer to graduation in the PhD program, to get to the research that I'm currently doing now, this big question, which is how do seemingly powerless people obtain and retain power? I became obsessed with this question because in my own work, in my own activism, it was important to me to try to understand this grassroots discussion, but connecting it to real work. And the thread there was people who had seemingly less power. What did they do? How did they gain power? What does it look like historically in Durham, and not only in Durham, but across the world and whatever? So I said, well, after working with Dr. Link, he says you have to narrow down this big question, right? You have to actually have something to discuss. So I created an argument. This is something new to me at the time. What's an argument? And I decided that, well, government federally funded programs, i.e. anti-poverty programs, they were used to commandeer, control an emergent black student movement and black power movement in North Carolina. And obviously we have to get a little more specific than that, but ultimately what I've started to see was, at the same time, Terry Sanford and a lot of moderates were trying to create these anti-poverty programs to alleviate poverty, they were dealing with a group of young black activists, and I'll talk about Howard Fuller specifically, who was using those same funds to achieve their own interests, right? And what does that friction, what does that look like? How does that play out, you know? So in North Carolina, and this doesn't help that I have to discuss civil rights with the man himself, Steve Lawson, in the room, as it relates to this conversation, but it's good, right? Okay, so traditionally we see the civil rights movement as this metonym of the Greensboro Four seated at the front of the lunch counter, frozen in this black and white image. But few times do we eventually start to associate the civil rights movement. And it's interesting, when Steve was talking about the long civil rights movement, I could empathize with him because it has been revised and revised in so many different ways, we don't even know what it is anymore. But this conversation, as it relates to these images from the general public, few see this overlap of the civil rights movement with this radical emergent black power movement. So I don't want to go into too many details with Robert F. Williams, how that extends and goes back as far as 1958. But for now, let's just look at the images that we rarely associate with the sit-ins or the civil rights period. In North Carolina particularly, I choose it because it had the most HBCUs than any other state in the country. And I didn't think about how significant that was, but because I went to an HBCU, I realized, oh, this is a really large network of black students in a space. And if you know anything about Greensboro, if you know anything about, what's that, 85 Allen, right? You stretch it across, it goes to Winston, Charlotte, and Durham. You know that there's a tight network that connects in its own way. Everything's like 90 minutes away from each other. You can get there at any moment. So with this anti-poverty program conversation, there was this phrasing that I started to pay attention to that started to feature most inside these documents, which was a maximum feasible participation of the poor. And this idea that you can include or should include as many poor people as possible as you develop these agencies, right? These community action agencies, CAAs. This was a part of Lyndon Baines Johnson's CAP, right? Community action programs. So again, I'm gonna spare you the details, but for the most part, what we understand is that there had to be a certain percentage of poor people on the board of trustees at these local levels in order to implement certain funding or ideas. There had to be this shared community in decision making. That wasn't the case in North Carolina. In fact, we learned from To Right These Wrongs text that 47 of its founding members of Operation Breakthrough, which was the anti-poverty program in Durham, 47 of them were not poor. How many were on the board? 47. And not only that, were they not only not poor, they were not even middle class. They were all business leaders, white business leaders. And the man that organized or suggested the development of this board was a black man by the name of John Henry Wheeler. John Henry Wheeler was perhaps at the time the most powerful black man in North Carolina, in some cases, if not the country. He worked as the president of Mechanics and Farmers Bank. Now, that's an important name because this is going to get to the problem that was prominent in Durham, which was this exceptional Negro complex, where you had this exceptional representative to represent all blacks, even if it didn't necessarily fit into the economic status of those at the bottom. So what I started to look at was the resumes of each of these leaders, and I come to find out that John Henry Wheeler served on 20 different boards. At my friend Brandon Winford, who does work and published a book on John Henry Wheeler, I called him the day. I said, listen, John Henry Wheeler is too many places. I just don't know how one man could represent so many people. Now, before we get to Christina Green's book that includes women and discuss our separate ways, and Atwater and her own right, we got to see how did she get included? The way she gets included and the way we even learn about all these other factors and women participating, this anti-poverty programming, imaginable maximum feasible participation of the poor, the state federal programs, they wanted to end mass demonstrations. And I'll show you some research and some primary sources on how this is the case. They wanted to control black communities. They wanted to formalize integration. They wanted to promote black capitalism, much later, by the way. Either, we'll discuss that. But these activists at the bottom, the ones that would participate, they are going to have a different motive. And they want to start mass demonstrations, consider violence. They want community control, separation. They're anti-capitalist, increased black. At this point, the Mayor Garbeck of Durham, North Carolina, along with Terry Sanford, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a lot of other white Southerners, they are absolutely not supportive of this intention with their anti-poverty programming. This is not what they mean by their idea of helping the poor. So their ideas are facing this competition from these black activists, and these are in direct opposition. So just for the sake of time, I'm gonna speed through. Now let's get to this. This is the Greensboro News and Record, and this has been in the archives Dr. Link sent me to several times, but I wanted to get to this conversation about, well, what happened to this sit-in movement in Greensboro, Dr. Lawson? In my mind, I'm thinking, I want to trace Jesse Jackson, who everyone is connected with. They think of this charismatic leader, that problem that I told you about, this idea of these super titular black figures leading the cause. He's the president of North Carolina A&T. He's in his own right. Is associated with Dr. Keene. Governor Sanford, he decided that he wanted to promote this program where he's going to take the movement and getting into the television faction, right? So in his idea, he creates this network which will start to grow out of Yes, which I have it on the next slide. This Yes network creates a television program where he wants to create what he calls intelligible dialogue, right? And this is going to get the demonstrations out of the streets in its own way and to get students to talk about these problems, right? And this national television delegation is going to be a very big deal. Jackson, who led the street demonstrations, and you'll see here, has not been active in the civil rights movement since June. So in my mind, I'm thinking, how is it that immediately after this suggestion for this television solution, that one of the most important figures, Jesse Jackson at the time, starts to fade away from the light? If you want to go and check out the July development of the North Carolina Fund, July 18, 1963, you can get more information on that summer, but just know that that's the summer that there was a line drawn. And here you'll see a man by the name of William Thomas. He is aware of this. He is the president of the local corps. And what does he say? But if the administration hopes to eliminate street demonstrations, I covered it up. He says it will not work. He's aware that there's something at stake. This is an attempt to get these black students and these demonstrations out of the streets. Now, I just want to keep showing pictures. All right, so how does this progress? When I was talking about that YES program, that television program that Terry Sanford suggested, it morphs, and there's a direct line to it, into the Youth Educational Service by 1964, where Jesse Jackson was the first president of this organization. And at this time, those anti-poverty programs like VISTA, volunteers, you'll notice at these campuses across North Carolina, there will be these white liberal students who are descending onto these communities to tutor black children, et cetera. And this is what it looked like in the minds of these anti-poverty program developers. But this is what it turned into. So Boo is going to become more relevant, and I'm jumping these 4 to 5 years because I don't want to lose my time for the last 2 slides. But Malcolm X Liberation University, you can see that these radical changes are becoming more and more clear. Owusu Sadaku, which is Howard Fuller, he has his own development to this point. And let me explain this. Howard Fuller, the figure that I'm focusing on, not only for the text, but for this particular presentation, if I could give it to you in an image, it would be this man who's coming with these grand ideas, an integrationist who thought that if he only worked hard, got his master's degree in social work, that he could cure poverty. He wanted to eradicate poverty. He's idealistic, only to find out that that's not what the intentions were of the local anti-poverty boards. John Henry Wheeler, Floyd McKissick, who's the second half of my book, they're going to give him the head nod to come to Durham and get hired. George Esser loves him, Terry Sanford, all these men, because of the vouching of John Henry Wheeler. He's your quintessential safe black leader, but the problem is he's not as safe as they think. By the time he leaves, he's now going to a point where he doesn't want maximum feasible participation of the poor, he wants paid maximum feasible participation of the poor. So it's not enough to just have inclusion of poor people, he wants to pay poor people. How are you gonna have these black mothers who are absolutely trying to survive, in some cases $60 a month? I don't know how that is adjusted to inflation, you can look it up, but in 1966, 1967, when he meets Ann Atwater, she has this hole in her floor, in her room, in her roof, and she's living under the conditions of slumlords, particularly a man by the name of Abe Greenberg. This man, you can't describe the level of greed and the level of slumlording that he was able to get away with while also sitting on multiple boards that were responsible for black life in a lot of ways. Again, the book's coming, I give you more details, but for now, Howard Fuller is asking a critical question. How can we fight a war on poverty with the enemy sitting on the board? Abe Greenberg is sitting on the board, but I don't just stop with Abe Greenberg. I have to ask the next question. Well, who are the other 47, 48 people sitting on the board? What properties do they own? Then I get to the next question. Why do they want to have an anti-poverty program so bad to help these black poor mothers in this city? Then it gets to the conversation around urban renewal. Then I look at this urban renewal project that develops in Durham, and they're sending the Freeway 47, I can't think of it exactly, going through Durham, and these black families are displaced. And then it starts to occur to me, are they creating a problem and trying to cure it? I don't have all the answers, but this is what's happening as I get deeper in my research. Oh, I had the sound. Hold on, let's see if it plays, if it's loud enough.
That the idea of integration, say, is really a meaningless kind of experience unless there's a balance of power. In other words, the problem today is that you don't really have an effective human experience because there's a disparity of power between black and white people. And in order to have really meaningful integration, which define as really a human experience that is meaningful for both races, you must have some kind of balance of power. And I'm saying that in order for black people to obtain their own power, they must begin to turn inward to develop their own sense of power. This means that they've got to begin to develop their own leadership, they've got to begin to define their own terms, and they've got to begin to move in ways that are comfortable with them. And we have got to address ourselves into the problems of the poor black man.
Now,
and this has to be done by black people.
Now this isn't what I recorded last week, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, looking back. No, this was recorded in 1967 in the middle of Dr. Fuller he's Dr. Fuller now, doing the work. But, what's the time? Because I'll skip slides because I want to make sure I get to this one.
Keep going, man.
All right. So Howard Fuller, as I talked to him in his 80 years of age, and I have the most recorded interviews with Howard Fuller to this day, and I always ask him where his thoughts were looking back at those moments, while also extrapolating that with the information of those times, including his own words. And I asked the simple question, what was your biggest issue with these anti-poverty boards? And his main problem that he described to me was they gave lip service to anti-poverty, but they didn't want the actual structural radical change, like to actually give up the power that was pre-existing in Durham, even with the black elites, right? So here's a survey that I observed in 1968 conducted by the North Carolina Fund, right? And the question and at the time you gotta think about the fear that's happening about black uprisings that are coming south. The question becomes, why might blacks riot in North Carolina? Now, here you will see that the white response is the outside agitator, which is 74%, all right? Here, the black response was jobs. Now, this is the kind of decision-making that's happening, and these aren't even on the same thinking of what it is that could create a problem in North Carolina. Who's the outside agitator? I can unequivocally tell you who that is. It is the term, idealistically, the agitator for those that come into these local Southern communities and create trouble, but specifically in this case is Howard Fuller. He's known as the outside agitator, right? And this outside agitator is creating a lot of issues in these communities because now he's going to put, for the first time, he's going to articulate what black power is. And this is not something that we see up until Howard Fuller. And then we have these other attitudes that aren't necessarily connecting. Blacks should pray rather than demonstrate when asked, right? White attitudes, 92% agreed, right? So they don't want blacks in the streets organizing and protesting. Blacks must show they deserve equal rights, right? 78% agree, right? So these attitudes matter. So ball it up, throw it down. In review. Okay. Oh, he shouldn't be there that long. Hold on. We can fix that. Hold on. You just gotta, hold on. Should be able to click on this. Oh, no, we were there. All right, well, it's staying. All right, well, I can't even move it. All right, anyway, so, current slideshow. Well, what I have here, it's much better than this if it wasn't for his face still there. He's blocking everything. I have this dramatic ending with myself at the right with Obama, righteous warrior, and these arrows that's connecting Dr. Link with everyone. He being a contributor to me going viral after getting my dissertation and this conversation around my dedication to Nipsey Hussle, who had passed at the time. And then there was this image of Pippa Holloway over here in the corner, who helped me put together this job talk that ultimately got me my first job, fresh out of grad school at Sewanee University. She helped me with a lot of documents. All that's connected to this story because we end up eventually having this Futures of Black Power conference hosted by UF, funded by the Milbauer, right? In which we were able to bring Hassan Jeffries, Dr. Ashley Farmer, DeWeston Haywood, Brandon Winford. It was a phenomenal national event. And here is my University of North Carolina press contract, which I was able to gain by working with Dr. Link. The point that I'm making is it's not just the impact that Link has had on me directly, it's the impact that the people that Link has had an impact on has had on me indirectly, right? So it's this Link factory that keeps on giving, right? So Dr. Link has always been present. Now I can get rid of him and get to the overall review of the project. And not only was the North Carolina Fund and anti-poverty programming in its own way present during this emergent Black Power movement, the way that all of these are connected, and this is the point, and I hope to make this bigger argument in the book as well as with Soul City, the Office of Economic Opportunity provided funds and money that they were all in competition for to achieve and advance their own political and economic interests. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question for Madison. I enjoyed the paper, not hiking. And actually, it's a nice thing to I would say. You might talk about this in your favorite project. Does the movie Deliverance come up at all? Something you write now? I'm curious about that comic case. It's about responsibility and the really generous it's portrayed in the movie, but it's also about some of the landscapes and a dam being built on the river as well. So I'm curious if that comes up or complicates any way to write that.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I know the book Southern Water, Southern Power, Chris Manganello kind of talks about that up on the Chattooga River and some of those areas. Yeah, I think I don't really address Deliverance directly, but I think there's a lot in literature. There's a great movie, I think it's called The River Wild, in the 1962. It's like this love story mixed with between a TVA agent and someone whose grandmother is like an activist. It's got a lot of big people in it. I think it was 1962. There's a lot of literature that deals with this idea of the landscape and the relationship, I think, between, people, what is worth preserving? Is it people? Is it the community? Is it the landscape? Is it the place? And sort of all the, there's a lot of cases where all of that is rolled into one. One of the dams that I think particularly I've been asked about when I presented is Tellico on the Tennessee River, which is built around the same time and does employ some of the similar rhetoric and has some of the same organizing to defend it. And, I think why doesn't it succeed is a question that I've thought about. It does kind of complicate the story a little bit. I think there are some answers. Some of it is politics. The politics in Tennessee were somewhat different than North Carolina. And the politics in Virginia, Harry Byrd, who I mentioned, the Virginia delegation is very pro dam. And so it is complicated. I think the Tellico case also gets into this, gets caught up in the fate of the snail darter, and it sort of becomes, these environmentalists want to save the snail darter and they don't care about jobs and all this stuff, which the New River, I think, kind of controversy. And some of the other, there's also the Red River in Kentucky, kind of allied that a little bit by focusing on, it's about people, it's about place, it's about community. But yeah, Deliverance, I'll definitely sort of go back and think about that. That's a great question. Right, yeah. It's also, yeah. It is, yeah.
I've taught it, emphasize that aspect of
Right, for sure.
it. Next.
A question for each. AJ, I was just wondering, that photograph of Lincoln that you had.
Yeah.
Were you trying to channel Lincoln his shades,
Stokely Carmichael, yeah, that you were talking about the intersection of his work, right? And that was kind of more Stokely, yeah, definitely more Stokely, maybe H-Rap Brown. So.
That's something that AJ said that I was thinking about while we were doing your talk, and the reasons, for the feed of this project, and particularly the arguments that they were making about place and people and community. What's interesting to me is the racialized argument that's never spoken. Maybe urban is the key, instead of saying, the whistle, dog whistle. Because exactly at the time, in the early 60s, when they were planning, I guess, when they first got this, of course, this is precisely the time they're ripping up black neighborhoods, not just in the South, Atlanta, St. Petersburg, Tampa, Rochester, the Bronx, New York. At that very time, they're ripping up maybe not scenically beautiful places, but communities that were popular. And I wonder if in your research and maybe your writing, if you could emphasize this kind of racialized argument that's going on here.
For sure, yeah. I'm glad you asked that. There was a paper, part of my dissertation that I wrote. There's a similar campaign on the French Broad River that also defeats a dam project that was by the TVA. And I tried to, at one point, draw this connection between urban renewal in Asheville, which, I sort of talked about kind of gestured toward the gentrification problems there now. But it was one of the, at the time, biggest urban renewal projects in the Southeast. And so it's interesting that you have these black neighborhoods targeted for demolition and on further down or up, I guess, the French Broad River in downtown Asheville at basically the same time you have these communities out toward kind of Brevard area being saved from destruction. And there certainly is that, and I think it very much is the racialized, the urban, versus the rural, and these kind of the loaded nature of those terms. There's this quote from one of the citizens who's testifying against the French Broad dams, where she says, kind of the same silent majority idea. We're good people. I think at one point she says, we don't do drugs. We don't have marijuana plants in our backyard. We aren't violent. We don't have crime, right? And the whole specter, and the sort of the supposed pathologies of the city, of urban violence and riots and all that from the 60s is very much used against to say that's not here, right? So, yeah, you certainly do see that, and I think that's probably a bit of a better example that helps kind of flesh that out a bit more. But certainly in the late 60s, the urban association versus its foil, if you will. Sure.
That's a good question for you. If you look at 1948, when Carr Scott was elected governor, he ran a campaign that was really based on rural votes or progressivism. Fast forward 70 years, Donald Trump attracted solid support from the rural South, rural America, certainly rural North Carolina. So there's a big change that takes place here between the late 40s and the early 21st century. I wonder if that's something you thought about or considered as in your work.
Yes, for sure. Thanks. I think of a lot, and there's a great sort of edited collection that just came out that I was lucky to review for the Journal of Southern History. Shameful plug, but
and it addresses this question of why, you know, there was certainly resistance to kind of the New Deal era dam projects in some communities, but why those largely aren't defeated and why the later ones are. And some of it has to do with environmental policy, environmental law. But some of it, I think, part of what the collection argues, or one of the essays in it is, the nation changes so much. I think Scott would fit sort of in this, a lot of rural areas, needing, jobs, needing development, needing investment. And then, I think in some ways the politics of the New Deal coalition fading, and Nixon's sort of co-opting of kind of the hard hat revolt and blue collar kind of politics by the late 60s, early 70s, I think plays a role in that. And I think that's kind of what you're seeing play out with the whole rural silent majority angle, is this idea of we don't need the government anymore. We don't need, outside help, and this notion of like meritocracy. Whereas I think with Scott and with some of the New Deal coalition, that was the rural Southerners, white Southerners in particular, being such a big part of that, was the sense that there was this need for that much more. And by the late 60s and 1970s, I mean, you could still argue it's there, but there's this language to sort of say, no, we don't need the government. We don't need this. We don't need outside help. So. Sure. Yeah.
Couldn't tell if you're ahead.
So, as I was saying, Steve's comment was just the same thought that I had. Sort of the question of what communities are we're saying is highly racialized in this area. Because obviously the river is beautiful, but the kind of the thrust of the argument as you were reading is about the connections among the people, which of course Black people had in communities that were then 60 years old in many urban places. And so there's a really, it seems to be, stark contrast there, is where it's exploring. But there's also one, AJ, I don't know if you know this book, called Cut Off Your Project, which is about West Virginia. So it's Mingo County, West Virginia. And it's your story in a very rural place, which is what happens when you get federal money and local stakeholders sort of take over it from people that's being intended to help. And it's kind of, that story is kind of chaotic one, because it's kind of first person that's then kind of cleaned up, but it's a really useful book.
Cut off what?
They'll cut off your project.
They'll cut off your project.
And that's like a threat from the local bigwigs to like the kind of the actual community activists. In this case, called what, trying to build schools and bridges and things in England and West Virginia. I mean, I assume that there is there a revisions of literature that you're part of on that's kind of rereading the war on poverty programs?
Yes.
I don't know about this as an 19th century person. The 20th century seems like current events to me.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think that I am a part of it, but it's almost like it circles right back to where it started, because initially the aims of it is to include the poor, right? And then what we do is we get Greta DeJong's work, You Can't Eat Freedom. And she talks about how even those blacks who were receiving these programs and these ideas of freedom, it was not an economic gain or power for them. So that literature that she introduces, I'm more in alignment with her work, and how initially there was this romanticizing of these programs helping these poor, distraught families, but it wasn't really changing the economic or structural order at local levels. And so I'm a part of what I would say You Can't Eat Freedom's work is really suggesting, which is trying to gain a more of a control of not only resources, but one's own livelihood on a day-to-day basis outside of the anti-poverty program. The goal of the North Carolina Fund is to dissolve after 5 years. So when you speak of literature, George Esser, in theory, he's absolutely a director of the North Carolina Fund. In theory, he wants to make poor people in his own right independent, once the NC fund dissolves in 1968. But there's a problem. As he's funded by the OEO, there's these Hatch Act regulations and rules that these black activists are violating because you're not supposed to take partisan positions, but poor people are in partisan situations, and it becomes complicated. So yes, to answer your question, but I also think it goes right back to what some of the original policymakers and thinkers were attempting to do, which was to include poor people, but literature has revised it over the years to make it seem like there was corruption by black activists, and that's what disrupted it. But yeah, all right.
So this is a question for you, Richard. So what I take away from the topic again today, and what I'm interested in hearing you say more about, is that Howard Fuller, when he started out, was very optimistic.
Yes.
Right, about possibilities of actually doing government programs where we intend to accomplish. And then you're sort of suggesting that it came to a different, perspective and showed them imagery. But based on the conversations you've had with him now and the work that you're doing for the book, in a larger sense, could you comment a little bit more about what he sees as the ultimate goals that he might have wanted to achieve and what prevented him from doing so?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting because a lot of the activists that I write about, whether it's Malcolm X, Dr. King, these men are assassinated by the time they're 40 or so, right? And we have to assume or think about what would have been or what could have been. Someone like Howard Fuller has lived to see 80 plus, and I've had a chance to sit with him in his Milwaukee home. And to answer your question directly, I ask him two questions because he gets a lot of criticism for his these schools that are being funded by Walmart. And now he's being viewed in today's time as what would be called a sellout, right? Now, he says this: he doesn't have a problem with someone not accepting money from Walmart or billionaires. He just asks that people get out the way for the people who do, right? That's what he says now. Now, the reason he speaks like this is because he went as far left as you could go back in the 60s and 70s, to the point where he was in Africa fighting with rebels, and he was talking the highest forms of Maoist lingo, Black Power, Panther Party, and he saw it as almost borderline it wasn't pragmatic. So he was interested in developing schools, institutions, solutions, practical, tangible, hands-on things. And what he wanted to do was to create standalone institutions that could survive beyond his lifetime. He did this in the anti-poverty programs when he created what was called standalone neighborhood councils. This would operate outside of the funding and apparatus of the OEO as well as the NC fund, and he had to find money from somewhere. Okay, if you're not gonna get it from the federal government, which will be in violation of certain rules, then where would you get it? He speaks to me in 2020, 21 terms. Would I get it from Walmart then? How could I keep my organization from being controlled the least, right? His goal then and now is, and this is his quote, not mine, AJ, you have to figure out how many contradictions you want to live with. This is what he says. And I listen to that and think about what he's willing to do. And he says that I could not have any money, but then there won't be a Howard Fuller Institute or a high school for all Black boys and girls in Milwaukee that has a $2 million endowment that is effective in actually operating. But what does that come with? Back to the question that I have about the Anti-Poverty Board. What are their goals? And I think you were talking about the Koch brothers earlier, right? What are their goals? How many contradictions are you willing to live with? That's what I would say he leaves us with. Oh.
I could ask, I'll ask questions later. At what I'm sure will be our visit. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and conclude for today.